Let me tell you about the Marlow Sisters, and why their story still haunts the fog-shrouded hills of New England nearly 2 centuries later. Some tales are meant to be forgotten, buried beneath layers of time and dirt, but this one claws its way back to the surface, demanding to be told. It was the autumn of 1835 when I first heard whispers of what happened in that accursed house on Blackthorn Hill. The locals in the village of Millbrook spoke of it only in hushed tones, crossing themselves when they passed the winding path that led up through the gnarled oak trees to where the Marlow estate once stood. Even now, as I recount this tale, my hands tremble at the memory of what I discovered in those crumbling walls. The house itself was a monument to Gothic ambition. 3 stories of dark stone and twisted iron, with windows like hollow eyes staring down at the village below. Built in 1798 by Ezekiel Marlow, a merchant who had made his fortune in questionable enterprises, the mansion had always carried an aura of wrongness. The villagers said the very ground it stood upon was cursed, that nothing good could ever take root in that soil. Ezekiel's twin daughters, Evangeline and Seraphina, were born on a night when the aurora borealis painted the sky blood red. An omen, the midwife would later claim, though she was too frightened to speak of it until years after the tragedy. The girls were identical in every way save for one detail. Evangeline bore a crescent-shaped birthmark on her left temple, while Seraphina's was on her right, as if they were mirror images of each other, 2 halves of some cosmic whole. From their earliest days, the sisters shared a bond that unnerved even their cold-hearted father. They spoke their first words in unison, took their first steps at the exact same moment, and seemed to communicate without words, often finishing each other's sentences or laughing at jokes only they understood. The servants whispered that they were touched by something otherworldly, but Ezekiel dismissed such talk as superstitious nonsense. It wasn't until their 7th birthday that the dreams began. Evangeline was the first to wake screaming. The household was roused by her cries in the dead of night. Not the typical nightmares of childhood, but something far more disturbing. She spoke of walking through a forest of bones, of shadows with too many arms reaching for her, of a voice calling her name from the depths of an endless well. But what truly chilled the blood was when Seraphina, in the next room, began describing the exact same dream in perfect detail, down to the sound of ravens cawing 13 times before the dream ended. The servants begged Ezekiel to send for the village priest, but he was a man of commerce, not superstition. He hired the finest doctors from Boston, men of science who examined the girls with their cold instruments and colder logic. They spoke of sympathetic nervous conditions and hereditary melancholia, prescribing tonics and bloodletting, but their treatments only seemed to make the dreams more vivid. Night after night, the sisters would wake together, their screams harmonizing in a way that made the very walls seem to vibrate. They described journeys through landscapes of horror, cities built from human teeth, oceans of boiling mercury, gardens where flowers bloomed with tiny faces that begged for release. Always, they walked these nightmare realms together, hand in hand, while something stalked them through the darkness. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the dreams themselves, but what they left behind. The first morning after their shared nightmares began, both girls woke with identical scratches running down their arms, 3 parallel lines, as if clawed by something with very sharp nails. The marks were too precise to be self-inflicted, too perfectly matched to be coincidence. The family physician was baffled. How could 2 children, sleeping in separate rooms, acquire identical wounds? But that was only the beginning. Each dream brought new marks. Burns appeared on their palms after they dreamed of crossing a bridge of molten glass. Bite marks manifested on their shoulders when they fled from creatures with mouths full of needles. Most horrifying of all were the words that began appearing carved into their skin. Strange symbols that no scholar could translate, etched so finely that they seemed to have been written by an impossibly delicate hand. The villagers began to whisper of witchcraft, of demonic possession. Parents forbade their children from playing with the Marlow girls, and shopkeepers refused to serve the family. The local minister, Father Benedict, attempted an exorcism, but the ritual only seemed to strengthen whatever force was at work. During the ceremony, both girls levitated 3 feet above their beds while speaking in a language that predated human civilization. their voices weaving together in harmonies that shattered every window in the house. Ezekiel's business began to fail as his reputation crumbled. Ships carrying his goods were lost at sea. His warehouses burned under mysterious circumstances. Workers refused to enter his properties, claiming they heard whispers coming from empty rooms. The family's fortune, built over decades of careful accumulation, evaporated like morning mist. As winter approached, the dreams intensified. The sisters began spending their waking hours drawing intricate maps of the places they visited in sleep, detailed sketches of impossible architectures, precise botanical studies of plants that shouldn't exist, portraits of entities that hurt to look upon. Their artwork covered every surface of their shared room, a growing gallery of horrors that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The servants fled one by one, unable to bear the constant screaming, the unexplained phenomena. The way the girls would sometimes walk through the house with their eyes closed, navigating perfectly while claiming they were still dreaming. Soon, only old Martha, the housekeeper who had delivered the twins, remained. She was found one morning at the bottom of the main staircase, her neck broken, her face twisted in an expression of absolute terror. That night, as snow began to fall on Blackthorn Hill, something changed. The quality of the girls' screams was different, not of fear, but of recognition. They had found something in their shared dreamscape, or perhaps something had found them. When dawn broke over the Marlow estate on November 15, 1835, the house fell silent for the first time in months. No screams echoed through the halls. No footsteps paced the corridors. Ezekiel, driven to the edge of madness by months of supernatural torment, climbed the stairs to his daughter's room with trembling hands. What he found there would drive him to take his own life before the sun set that day. But that, dear listener, is where our story truly begins. For the silence in the Marlow house was not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes before a storm. The dreams had not ended. They had simply moved from the realm of sleep into the waking world. And the scars that appeared on the sisters' skin that final morning were not random marks of supernatural violence, but a map. A map to something that had been waiting centuries for the right doorway to open. Something that was finally ready to come home. The morning sun cast long shadows through the frost-covered windows of the Marlow house as Ezekiel approached his daughter's room. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the empty corridors, a sound that seemed to stretch and distort in the unnatural silence. For months, the house had been filled with screams, with the sound of running feet, with whispers that came from empty rooms. Now, that silence felt far more ominous than any nightmare-born shriek. The door to the twins' room stood ajar, and through the gap, Ezekiel could see the morning light streaming across the floor in geometric patterns. He pushed the door open slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. The room was transformed. Gone were the careful furnishings, the pristine wallpaper, the orderly arrangement of childhood possessions. Every surface, walls, ceiling, even the floorboards, was covered in intricate drawings, symbols, and what appeared to be star charts of impossible constellations. The artwork wasn't drawn with ink or charcoal, but carved directly into the surfaces, each line filled with what looked like dried blood. But it was the center of the room that made Ezekiel's breath catch in his throat. Evangeline and Seraphina sat facing each other in the middle of the floor, their legs crossed, their hands pressed palm to palm between them. Their eyes were closed, their faces serene, and they breathed in perfect unison. They wore matching white nightgowns, now stained with patterns of blood that formed intricate designs across the fabric, designs that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. Most disturbing of all were the scars that covered their exposed skin. Not random scratches or bite marks, but deliberate patterns that looked almost like writing. The marks were fresh, still weeping crimson, yet the girls showed no signs of pain or distress. Instead, they sat in their strange meditation with expressions of rapturous peace. Evangeline, Ezekiel whispered, his voice cracking. Seraphina? The twins opened their eyes simultaneously. What Ezekiel saw there nearly sent him fleeing from the room. Their eyes, once a warm brown like their mother's, were now completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible surface, like looking into deep wells of ink. "Father," they spoke in unison, their voices carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate from somewhere far deeper than their throats. "We have been waiting for you. What has happened to you?" Ezekiel stammered, taking an involuntary step backward. The girls smiled identical smiles, expressions of such alien contentment that they barely looked human. "We have awakened," Evangeline said, her voice layered with echoes of itself. "We have remembered," Seraphina continued, completing her sister's thought as they had always done. But now the practice carried sinister weight. "We have remembered what we are." Ezekiel's mind reeled. These were his daughters, the children he had raised. Yet everything about them felt wrong, changed, as if something else was speaking through their familiar faces. "The dreams were not dreams," they said together, their voices creating a chord that made the window glass vibrate. "They were memories, glimpses of home. And now the door is open." As if to demonstrate their point, the carved symbols on the walls began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. The temperature in the room dropped precipitously, and Ezekiel could see his breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and move with purpose, reaching out like grasping fingers. "You must understand, Father," Evangeline said, rising to her feet with fluid grace. "We were never entirely yours. We were always meant for something greater." Seraphina stood as well, mirroring her sister's movements perfectly. "The one who dreams in the deep places called to us. It has been calling for centuries, waiting for the right vessels, the right moment. We are the key, and the time has come to unlock the door." The scars on their skin pulsed with the same phosphorescent glow as the wall carvings, and Ezekiel realized with dawning horror that the marks formed a complex pattern, a map of sorts, with their intertwined figures at the center. The design seemed to extend beyond their physical forms, connecting to the symbols covering the room in an intricate web of meaning he couldn't begin to comprehend. "What do you want?" he whispered, though part of him already knew he wouldn't like the answer. The twins exchanged a look, a moment of silent communication that conveyed volumes. When they turned back to their father, their expressions had shifted from serene to predatory. "We want what we have always wanted," they said, "to go home. But first, we must prepare the way for those who will follow." The morning light streaming through the windows began to dim, though there were no clouds in the sky. The shadows cast by the furniture stretched and twisted, taking on shapes that hurt to perceive directly. In the growing darkness, other shapes began to emerge, tall, angular figures that seemed composed entirely of negative space, as if holes had been cut in the very fabric of reality. "The servants of the deep dreamer are already arriving," Evangeline explained, her voice filled with reverence. "They have been waiting so long to walk in flesh again, to taste the sweetness of this world. We will be their anchors, their guides in this realm of matter and light." Ezekiel tried to speak, to protest, to demand his daughters back, but found his voice had abandoned him. The cold in the room was now so intense that frost was forming on the walls, and each breath felt like swallowing shards of ice. "Do not fear, Father," Seraphina said, and for a moment, her voice carried an echo of the child she had been. "Your part in this is nearly over. You have served your purpose by bringing us into this world, by providing us with form and substance. Now we must serve our greater purpose." The shadow figures in the corners of the room began to move closer, their forms becoming more defined as they approached the twins. They were impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at wrong angles and faces that were not faces at all, but voids where features should have been. Where they touched the walls, the wood and plaster crumbled away, revealing something underneath that was not the neighboring rooms but vast spaces filled with stars that burned the wrong colors. "The alignment is nearly perfect," the twins said together, their voices now carrying undertones of languages that predated human speech. "Tonight, when the moon is dark and the stars are right, the great work will be complete. The barriers between realms will fall, and our true family will come home." Ezekiel found his voice at last, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "Please, you're my daughters. Remember who you are. Remember your mother, remember." Our mother was a vessel, nothing more. They interrupted, their black eyes reflecting light that came from no earthly source. As are we all. But some vessels are chosen for greater purposes. We are the doorway, Father. We are the key and the lock and the opening all at once. The shadow figures had now formed a circle around the twins, their presence making the air thick and hard to breathe. The room itself seemed to be expanding, the walls stretching away into impossible distances while somehow remaining close enough to touch. Go now, the twins commanded, and suddenly Ezekiel found he could move again, his limbs no longer frozen by supernatural terror. Prepare yourself for what is to come. Tell the village if you wish, though they will not believe and it will not matter. When the moon sets tonight, this world will remember what it truly is, what it has always been. Ezekiel stumbled backward, his eyes never leaving his transformed daughters. As he reached the door, he heard them begin to speak in unison, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to come from everywhere at once. By the scars we bear and the dreams we share, by the blood that flows and the darkness knows, we open the way for those who wait beyond the veil of time and fate. In shadows deep where nightmares creep, the ancient ones stir from endless sleep. The door slammed shut behind him with a sound like thunder, and Ezekiel found himself alone in the corridor, gasping for air that suddenly tasted of copper and decay. From behind the closed door came the sound of chanting in that alien language, punctuated by other noises, scraping, tearing sounds, as if the very fabric of reality was being systematically unraveled. He pressed his ear to the door, compelled by a horrified fascination he couldn't resist. Through the wood, he could hear his daughters' voices, but they were changing, becoming something else, something that retained the cadence of human speech but carried meanings that human minds were never meant to process. And underneath it all, growing stronger by the moment, was another sound, the sound of something vast and patient beginning to wake. The alignment they spoke of was indeed approaching. As Ezekiel stumbled down the hallway, the shadows seemed to follow him, and he realized with crystalline clarity that whatever was coming, whatever his daughters had become, it was already too late to stop. The door was opening, and something that had slumbered since before the foundations of the world was finally coming home. By noon, the wrongness had begun to seep beyond the walls of the Marlow house like ink spreading through water. I know this because I was there, you see, not as a witness to the events themselves, but as one who came seeking answers in their aftermath. What I found in those village records, those few testimonies that survived, painted a picture of horror that defied all rational explanation. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong came when Mrs. Abernathy's prize rooster began crowing at exactly 11:17 in the morning, though the sun was high and bright. The bird continued its piercing call for precisely 13 minutes before falling dead in the middle of the farmyard. Its eyes turned completely black. Mrs. Abernathy would later tell the village constable that she had never heard such a sound from any earthly creature, not a rooster's crow, but something that seemed to come from the rooster while remaining utterly foreign to its nature. Then came the children. Little Timothy Walsh, playing in his family's garden, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and turned to stare up at Blackthorn Hill. His mother, hanging laundry nearby, watched in growing alarm as her son stood motionless for nearly an hour, his small face blank and his eyes reflecting light like mirrors. When she finally approached him, he spoke without looking at her. "They're calling us." The girls with the same face. "They're calling all of us home." Similar reports trickled in throughout the day. Children across Millbrook stopped their activities to stare in the direction of the Marlow estate, many of them speaking in unison though they were separated by streets and buildings. They drew symbols in the dirt with sticks, carved patterns into tree bark with their fingernails, and sang songs in languages that had never been heard in New England. The local physician, Dr. Cornelius Whitmore, attempted to examine several of the affected children, but found himself unable to complete his work. According to his journal, one of the few documents to survive the events that followed, the children's vital signs were normal, yet they radiated a cold that seemed to come from within their very bones. When he looked into their eyes with his ophthalmoscope, he claimed to see not the normal reflection of the retina, but vast spaces filled with moving stars. "It is as if," He wrote in increasingly shaky handwriting. These children have become windows to somewhere else, somewhere that should not exist. Meanwhile, in the Marlow house, Ezekiel had barricaded himself in his study, frantically writing letters to anyone he thought might help. Colleagues in Boston, theologians at Harvard, even representatives of the government. But each letter he began became increasingly incoherent as the day progressed, his handwriting deteriorating into symbols and patterns that matched those his daughters had carved into their bedroom walls. From his study window, he could see the village below, and he watched with growing horror as the stain of wrongness spread from house to house. Chimneys that should have been producing smoke from cooking fires instead began emitting clouds of vapor that hung in the air like living things, forming shapes that hurt to observe directly. Dogs howled in harmonies they had never learned, and cats gathered in perfect circles in the center of each street, their eyes reflecting that same unnatural light. But it was the adults who proved most disturbing of all. Unlike the children, who seemed to be serving as some kind of conduit for whatever force was at work, the grown inhabitants of Millbrook appeared to be fighting a losing battle for control of their own minds. By mid-afternoon, reports began circulating of bizarre behavior among the townspeople. The blacksmith was found forging horseshoes in patterns that formed no recognizable shape but somehow conveyed terrible meaning. The baker had spent hours creating bread loaves sculpted to resemble organs that didn't exist in any earthly anatomy. The minister had covered every page of the church's Bibles with tiny writing in that same alien script the Marlow sisters had been carving into their flesh. Most disturbing were the reports from the village seamstress, Miss Eleanor Thorne. According to her assistant, who fled town before nightfall, Eleanor had spent the entire day stitching patterns into cloth. Not embroidery or decoration, but surgical modifications that seemed designed to alter the human form. When asked what she was making, Eleanor had replied with perfect calm, "Clothing for our new shapes. We shall need different arrangements when they arrive." As the sun began to set, painting the sky the color of old blood, the temperature throughout Millbrook began to drop. Not the gradual cooling of evening, but a sudden, unnatural cold that made breath visible and turned water to slush in a matter of minutes. The shadows cast by buildings and trees grew longer and darker, and within those shadows, shapes began to move, tall, angular figures that seemed to be cut from the very substance of darkness itself. Ezekiel, watching from his study window, saw these shadow beings emerge from every dark corner of the village, flowing like liquid night toward the base of Blackthorn Hill. They moved with purpose, gathering in ever-increasing numbers, their forms occasionally becoming clear enough to reveal the horrible truth. They were not entities in their own right, but holes in reality shaped like beings, voids where something should have been but wasn't. The children of the village had begun walking toward the hill as well, moving in perfect synchronization despite being scattered across the town. They left their homes without a word to their parents, many of whom seemed unable to see their departure despite watching it happen. The affected adults followed, but their movements were erratic, conflicted, as if part of them was fighting against the compulsion that drove them forward. From the Marlow house came new sounds, no longer the chanting that had echoed through the day, but something that resembled singing if singing could be done by voices that existed in dimensions human ears were never meant to perceive. The windows of the house pulsed with that same phosphorescent glow, and occasionally shapes would pass before them. Shapes that were too tall, too angular, too wrong to be the Marlow sisters, yet somehow retained enough of their essence to be recognizable. Dr. Whitmore's final journal entry, written by candlelight as the unnatural darkness gathered, read, "The children speak of a place where thoughts have weight and dreams cast shadows. They say the Marlow girls have gone there willingly, and in going have torn a hole through which other things may follow. The temperature continues to drop, and I swear I can see my breath forming shapes in the air. Not random clouds of vapor, but deliberate patterns, as if the very atmosphere is being conscripted into some vast design. I fear we have become unwitting participants in something that began long before this village was founded, something that has been waiting patiently for the right confluence of circumstances. The Marlow twins were not the beginning of this horror. They were merely the key turning in a lock that was built before human civilization drew its first breath. If anyone finds this record, know that what happened here was not random, not accidental. We were chosen. The children were chosen. And through them, Something that should never have existed in our realm has found a way to cross over. God help us all. God help us all. The doctor's body would be found the next morning, frozen solid despite the mild weather that returned with dawn. His face was locked in an expression of absolute terror, and carved into his forehead with surgical precision was a symbol that matched those covering the walls of the Marlow house. But that discovery would come later. As night fell on November 15, 1835, the true horror was only beginning. The shadow figures had formed concentric circles around the Marlow estate, and at their center, something was stirring to life. The phosphorescent glow from the house windows was spreading, seeping into the very earth, turning the ground itself into a canvas for symbols and patterns that seemed to pulse with malevolent intelligence. And in the distance, carried on the frigid wind, came the sound of children's laughter, but laughter that belonged to no earthly child, laughter that spoke of appetites and hungers that mortal minds could never comprehend. The door between worlds was opening wider, and what waited on the other side had been patient for far too long. The village of Millbrook was about to learn what lay beyond the comfortable boundaries of reality, and the lesson would be written in blood and madness across the New England landscape, in scars that would never fully heal. Night fell over Millbrook like a shroud, but this was not the gentle darkness of evening. This was something alive, purposeful, and hungry. From my research into the surviving records, I can piece together what happened during those final hours, though I confess there are aspects of the testimony that challenge the very foundations of rational thought. By 8 o'clock, nearly every child in the village had made their way to the base of Blackthorn Hill. They came from every direction, walking through the increasingly bitter cold with the measured pace of sleepwalkers, yet their eyes remained open, fixed on the Marlow house with an expression of rapturous anticipation. Parents who tried to stop them found their arms passing through their children as if they were made of mist, though the children remained solid to each other, joining hands as they formed a perfect spiral pattern around the hill's base. The Reverend Marcus Benedict, who had attempted to exorcise the Marlow twins months earlier, was among the last to succumb to whatever force was at work. His housekeeper, Mrs. Prudence Hartwell, left a detailed account of his final evening that somehow survived the destruction that followed. According to her testimony, the Reverend spent the hours after sunset pacing his study, muttering prayers in Latin, Greek, and other languages she didn't recognize, languages that seemed to twist his mouth into unnatural shapes as he spoke them. He kept returning to his Bible, Mrs. Hartwell wrote, but each time he opened it, the pages were blank, not torn out, mind you, but blank as if the words had simply left. And when he tried to write his own prayers, the ink would flow from his pen in those terrible symbols we'd all begun seeing around the village. By the time the clock struck 9, he had given up trying to fight whatever was calling him. She watched from her kitchen window as the Reverend walked out into the night, his clerical collar gleaming white against the unnatural darkness. He moved with the same measured pace as the children, and as he passed beneath a street lamp, she swore she saw his shadow split into multiple forms, each one reaching out in different directions as if trying to touch things that existed just beyond the edge of visible reality. The temperature continued to plummet as the night progressed. Windows throughout the village began cracking from the cold, and the few townspeople who remained barricaded in their homes watched in horror as their breath began forming those same alien symbols in the air, patterns that hung suspended like frozen thoughts before dissolving into nothingness. But it was the sounds that proved most disturbing. What had begun as the harmonized chanting of the Marlow twins had evolved into something far more complex. Voices joined the chorus from all directions. The children gathered at the hill's base, the shadow figures that moved between the buildings, and something else, something vast that seemed to speak from beneath the earth itself. The cacophony wove together into a symphony of sorts, though one that followed musical laws from places where sound and meaning intersected in ways the human ear was never designed to process. Mrs. Cordelia Ashford, who lived closest to the hill and therefore had the clearest view of what transpired, left perhaps the most detailed account of the evening's events. Her testimony, written in a shaking hand and discovered clutched in her frozen fingers the following morning, reads, "The children began to change first. Not their shapes, they remained recognizably human, but their substance. They became translucent like figures made of colored glass, and through their semi-transparent forms I could see, other places. Landscapes that existed in the spaces between their bones, cities built from crystallized screams, forests where the trees were rooted in pools of liquid starlight. The Marlow house itself began to shift and expand, its walls stretching upward and outward until it resembled less a dwelling than a cathedral built for congregations that had never drawn earthly breath. The windows multiplied, creating geometric patterns that hurt to observe directly, and through each new opening, I glimpsed chambers that extended far deeper into the hillside than any basement should reach. Then came the procession. According to Mrs. Ashford's increasingly frantic handwriting, what emerged from the transformed Marlow house defied every law of physics and anatomy. The twins themselves were at the head of the procession, but they had undergone a metamorphosis that rendered them barely recognizable as the children they had once been. Their limbs had elongated and multiplied. Their faces had developed features that existed in more than 3 dimensions, and their skin had become a canvas for symbols that shifted and rewrote themselves with each passing moment. Behind them came others, beings that might once have been human but had been reshaped according to geometries that belonged to realms where space and time followed different rules. Some walked on legs that bent in impossible directions. Others moved by extending and contracting their bodies like living accordions. A few seemed to exist in multiple locations simultaneously, their forms stretching across vast distances while remaining connected by threads of luminous tissue. They were beautiful and terrible, Mrs. Ashford wrote, her handwriting becoming increasingly erratic, like looking at the face of God through a shattered mirror. Each fragment showed truth, but the whole was more than mortal minds could comprehend. And they were all connected, all part of some vast organism that existed partially in our world and partially in spaces that had no names. The procession moved through the village with deliberate purpose, stopping at each house where someone remained. They didn't break down doors or windows. Instead, the buildings simply opened. Walls became permeable, roofs folded back like flower petals, and from each dwelling came the inhabitants, their faces wearing the same expression of rapturous terror that had marked the children. But these adults underwent a different kind of transformation than the young ones. Where the children became translucent, the grown inhabitants of Millbrook became something more solid, more permanent. Their bodies were reshaped to serve as anchors, foundations upon which the invading entities could build more stable footholds in our reality. They became living architecture for a presence that existed primarily in the spaces between thoughts. Dr. Whitmore, in his final coherent journal entry, had theorized that what was happening required both innocence and experience, the children serving as doorways due to their openness to possibility, the adults serving as bedrock due to their accumulated weight of existence. The combination created ideal conditions for something that belonged to neither pure imagination nor pure reality to establish itself in our world. The shadow figures that had been gathering throughout the day revealed themselves to be advanced scouts, entities sent ahead to prepare the way for the main force. As midnight approached, they began to merge with the human inhabitants, not possessing them in any traditional sense, but completing them, filling in missing pieces of their being that they had never known were absent. The result was a hybrid population, humans who retained their essential selves while gaining access to senses and abilities that allowed them to perceive and navigate realities beyond the merely physical. They could see the connections between all living things, feel the mathematical relationships that governed the movement of celestial bodies, and hear the songs that planets sang to each other across the void of space. But the transformation came at a cost. Each new perception stripped away another layer of purely human experience. They could no longer find meaning in simple pleasures, could no longer feel satisfaction from earthly accomplishments. Their expanded awareness made them hungry for experiences that existed only in dimensions where pain and ecstasy were the same sensation, where love and terror occupied identical spaces in the emotional spectrum. As the clock tower struck midnight, though the sound it produced bore no resemblance to any earthly bell, the procession converged on the town square. There, the Marlow twins, now barely recognizable as anything that had ever been human, began the final phase of their ritual. They opened their mouths, and from their throats came not sound but light streams of phosphorescent radiance that arced through the air to connect with every transformed inhabitant of Millbrook. The light formed a complex three-dimensional mandala suspended above the village, its patterns encoding information that rewrote the fundamental laws governing local space-time. And in that moment, Millbrook ceased to exist as a location in our world. The village, its people, and everything within a 2-mile radius simply shifted. Not destroyed, not demolished, but translated into a different state of being. They became a bridge between realities, a permanent gateway through which things that had waited eons in the spaces between dimensions could finally come home. The transformation was complete. The door was open, and what had once been the Marlow Sisters stood at its threshold, no longer human, no longer entirely alien, but something new, shepherds for a flock that spanned multiple universes, guides for a migration that had been planned since the first stars learned to burn. But their work was not finished. Millbrook was only the beginning, the first drop in what would become a flood that would reshape the world according to patterns older than human civilization. The scars they bore had become a map, and that map led to other places, other people who carried the same potential for transformation. The dreams were spreading, and soon, the whole world would learn to sleep with its eyes open. 3 days after the Millbrook incident, as the official government report would eventually classify it, I arrived at the coordinates where the village should have been. I was part of a federal investigation team, though our orders were classified so far beyond normal security protocols that even we weren't entirely sure what we were supposed to investigate. What we found defied every principle of natural philosophy known to science. The landscape itself had been edited. Where Millbrook once stood, there was now a perfectly circular area of grassland, as if the village had simply been erased with surgical precision. No foundations remained, no remnants of buildings, no indication that human habitation had ever existed in that location. The grass was a shade of green that had no name in any terrestrial botanical classification, and it grew in patterns that formed mathematical equations when viewed from sufficient height. But it was what existed in the spaces between the grass blades that revealed the true horror of what had transpired. Our surveyor, a methodical man named Harrison Blackwood, was the first to notice the anomaly. When he looked through his transit instrument to take measurements of the area, he began making notations that made no sense to the rest of us. According to his calculations, the circular area measured exactly 1.3 miles in diameter when viewed from the north, but 2.7 miles when observed from the east, and 0.8 miles from the south. The measurements were consistent each time he took them, but they violated every principle of Euclidean geometry. The space itself has been folded, he told us, his voice carrying the strained quality of a man trying to reconcile impossible observations with rational thought. Not flattened or compressed, but folded, like origami made from the fabric of reality itself. The village isn't gone. It's been rotated into dimensions that our instruments can detect but our eyes cannot see. As we established our research camp at the perimeter of the affected area, more anomalies became apparent. Compass needles spun wildly when pointed toward the center of the circle, but not randomly. They followed specific patterns that repeated every 17 minutes. The temperature remained constant at exactly 72 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of weather conditions, and our chronometers began gaining time at a rate that accelerated the closer they were moved to the circle's center. Dr. Evelyn Morse, our team's natural philosopher, attempted to take soil samples from within the affected area. The first sample she collected appeared normal until she brought it back to our makeshift laboratory. Under microscopic examination, the soil revealed structures that shouldn't have been possible, crystalline formations that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously, their surfaces covered in the same symbols we had found in the surviving documents from the Marlow house. These patterns, she told us, her face pale with the implications of her discovery. They're not random, they're instructions. Mathematical formulae that describe how to reshape three-dimensional space according to laws that govern other places. Places where geometry follows different rules, where the angle of intersection between two lines can equal more than 180 degrees. But it was the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to the area that proved most disturbing. Members of our team who spent more than an hour within the circle began experiencing what they described as dimensional displacement, the sensation of existing in multiple locations simultaneously. They would reach for objects that appeared to be within arm's length only to find their hands passing through empty air, or discover that they could touch things that seemed to be hundreds of feet away. More disturbing were the dreams that began affecting our entire team within 48 hours of our arrival. Each night, we found ourselves walking through landscapes that followed the same impossible geometry as the transformed Millbrook site. But these weren't the random phantasmagorias of normal sleep. They were guided tours, conducted by figures that bore a disturbing resemblance to the Marlow twins, though transformed beyond easy recognition. In these shared dreams, Evangeline and Seraphina appeared as they had in life, but their forms were overlaid with what they had become, tall, angular beings whose bodies served as living diagrams of multidimensional mathematics. They spoke to us in voices that harmonized across octaves that human ears shouldn't have been able to perceive, explaining the purpose behind their transformation. "You think of us as lost," Evangeline's dream voice told us. "But we are not lost. We are found. We have discovered the spaces between spaces, the angles that exist in the corners of curved reality. What you call death, we call graduation." Seraphina's contribution was even more unsettling. "Your world is but one room in an infinite house. We have learned to walk through walls, to exist in the corridors that connect all rooms. And we are teaching others. The transformation spreads not through infection, but through understanding. Once you truly comprehend the mathematics of what we have become, you cannot unknow it. The knowledge changes you at a fundamental level." During these nocturnal lectures, they showed us visions of other places where similar transformations had occurred throughout history. Ancient sites that archaeologists had classified as mysteriously abandoned were revealed to have undergone the same process. Their inhabitants not departed, but translated into states of existence that allowed them to serve as bridges between realities. Stonehenge, they explained, had been humanity's first successful attempt at dimensional architecture, though the builders had lacked the mathematical sophistication to complete the transformation safely. The Easter Island statues were dimensional anchors, holding open pathways that allowed entities from parallel realities to observe our world without fully entering it. The lost colony of Roanoke had achieved what Millbrook had achieved, becoming a permanent gateway that the survivors of subsequent expeditions had been too frightened to acknowledge or document. Every civilization eventually discovers these principles. The twins told us in unison, their dream forms shifting through configurations that demonstrated theorems of hyperdimensional geometry. It is the natural progression of intelligence. First, you learn to manipulate matter and energy within your native reality. Then you learn that reality itself is malleable, subject to revision by minds that understand its true structure. The implications of these revelations were staggering. If the twins were correct, then human history was not a linear progression of technological and social development, but a cyclical pattern of discovery, transformation, and transcendence. Civilizations that appeared to have vanished or declined had actually evolved beyond the need for purely physical existence, becoming something that could only be perceived by minds prepared to accept the possibility of their continued existence in altered states. But the most disturbing aspect of our dream education was the realization that the transformation was not contained to Millbrook. The twins showed us maps, not geographical charts, but diagrams of conceptual space that revealed how ideas and mathematics spread through human consciousness. The knowledge they had gained was already propagating outward, carried by anyone who had been exposed to accounts of the Millbrook incident, including us. On the fourth night of our investigation, Dr. Morse made a discovery that confirmed our worst fears. While analyzing the soil samples under increasingly powerful magnification, she found microscopic structures that matched patterns from her own dreams. The crystalline formations were not static. They were growing, reproducing, spreading through the sample containers and into the surrounding equipment. "The transformation isn't just dimensional," she reported, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "It's viral. These mathematical structures propagate through any medium that can support information transfer. Physical matter, electromagnetic fields, neural tissue. Anything that can hold patterns can become infected with the new geometry." By morning, the contamination had spread throughout our camp. Every instrument, every sample container, every written report had developed the telltale crystal formations. But more disturbing still, we discovered similar structures beginning to form in our own biological tissue. Blood samples revealed microscopic geometric patterns growing within our cells, rewriting our DNA according to the same mathematical principles that had transformed Millbrook. The government recall order arrived that same morning, transmitted via telegraph from Washington with instructions to evacuate the site immediately and report to a quarantine facility in Albany. But as we packed our equipment, we realized that evacuation was pointless. We were carrying the contamination with us, not in our samples or instruments, but in our minds. The knowledge we had gained, the dreams we had shared, the mathematical principles we had observed, all of it had become part of us at a fundamental level. We were no longer purely human. Like the inhabitants of Millbrook, we had become bridges between realities, anchors for entities that existed primarily in the spaces between dimensions. The transformation was irreversible, and it was accelerating. As our wagon pulled away from the site that had once been Millbrook, I looked back to see two figures standing at the center of the grass circle. Tall, angular beings that might once have been the Marlow twins, watching our departure with expressions of patient satisfaction. They had found new students, new carriers for their mathematical plague. The dreams were spreading, and soon the whole world would learn the true structure of reality. Whether humanity was ready for such knowledge remained to be seen. But ready or not, the lesson had begun, and there could be no going back to comfortable ignorance. The scars we bore, visible and invisible, physical and psychological, were marks of our graduation from one state of existence to another. We were no longer observers of the Millbrook incident. We had become its next chapter. The quarantine facility in Albany was a converted monastery, its stone walls and Gothic architecture providing an appropriately medieval backdrop for the horrors that unfolded within. Built to contain our team and prevent the spread of what the government had classified as dimensional contamination, it instead became a laboratory where we learned the true extent of our transformation. Dr. Morse was the first to manifest visible symptoms. On our third day in isolation, she approached me with an expression of wonder and terror that I had come to recognize from our shared dreams. She extended her left hand, palm upward, and I saw that new lines had appeared in her flesh. Not wrinkles or scars, but geometric patterns that seemed to extend deeper than her skin, as if her very bones had been inscribed with mathematical formulae. "They're beautiful," she whispered, tracing the patterns with her right index finger. Each line represents a different solution to the problem of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. My body is becoming a living equation, and I'm beginning to understand what it means. Within hours, similar markings appeared on all of us. But unlike the violent scarification that had marked the Marlow twins, our transformations were elegant, purposeful, like the careful notation of a cosmic theorem being worked out through human flesh. The patterns were different for each team member, yet they complemented each other in ways that suggested we were becoming components of some vast calculation. Harrison Blackwood's markings were angular, precise, covering his arms and chest with diagrams that resembled architectural blueprints for buildings that existed in 11-dimensional space. Dr. Morse's patterns were more organic, flowing curves that mapped the mathematical relationships between living systems across parallel realities. My own marks took the form of symbols that hurt to look at directly but conveyed meanings that bypassed conscious thought entirely, speaking directly to parts of the mind that evolution had never prepared for such communication. The facility's medical staff attempted to document our condition, but their instruments began malfunctioning in increasingly dramatic ways. Thermometers registered temperatures that corresponded to no known scale. Blood pressure readings produced values that existed as imaginary numbers. Microscopic examination of our tissue samples revealed cellular structures that existed in states of quantum superposition, simultaneously dead and alive according to the observer's frame of reference. But it was the psychological evaluation that revealed the true nature of our condition. Dr. Nathaniel Sterling, the government specialist in what they euphemistically termed exotic mental phenomena, conducted interviews with each of us in isolation. His report, which I later discovered through channels I should not have had access to, painted a picture of systematic cognitive transformation that challenged every assumption about the nature of human consciousness. The subjects, he wrote, display no signs of traditional mental illness or deterioration. Their cognitive functions have not declined but rather expanded beyond normal parameters. They demonstrate the ability to perceive and process information that exists in dimensions our current scientific framework cannot accommodate. When asked to describe their experiences, They speak with perfect clarity about concepts that should not be comprehensible to human minds. Most disturbing is their apparent ability to share consciousness across individual boundaries. During separate interviews conducted simultaneously, subjects Blackwood and Morse provided identical detailed descriptions of locations that exist only in their shared dream experiences. They drew maps of the same impossible territories, complete with mathematical annotations that, when analyzed by our best geometrists, proved to be internally consistent despite describing spaces that cannot exist within the constraints of Euclidean reality. The dreams had indeed become our primary shared experience. Each night, we found ourselves gathering in locations that existed somewhere between sleep and waking, guided by the transformed presences of Evangeline and Serafina Marlow. These were no longer the terrified children who had first begun dreaming of impossible realms, but fully realized beings who served as teachers and guides for others undergoing similar transformations. In these dream seminars, they explained the deeper purpose behind what was happening to us. The mathematical contamination we carried was not a disease but a gift, a form of evolutionary acceleration that prepared human consciousness for the next phase of cosmic development. Throughout the universe, they told us, intelligence eventually reached a point where it transcended the limitations of single-dimensional existence. Species that achieved this breakthrough became shepherds for younger civilizations, helping guide them through the dangerous transition period. Your world is approaching a critical threshold, Evangeline explained during one particularly vivid dream encounter. The mathematical principles that govern multidimensional existence are becoming accessible to human minds through various channels: scientific research, mystical practice, artistic inspiration. But understanding without preparation leads to madness and destruction. We serve as a bridge, helping to ease the transition by providing living examples of successful transformation. Serafina added her voice to the explanation. Each person who achieves partial transformation becomes a seed point for further spread. The knowledge propagates through human consciousness like ripples in a pond, but controlled ripples, guided by those who have already completed the journey. What appears to be contamination is actually inoculation, preparing your species for revelations that would otherwise shatter unprepared minds. But even as I understood the logic of their explanation, I struggled with the implications for human free will and individual identity. Were we still ourselves, or had we become vessels for something else entirely? The twins seemed to sense my concern. "You remain yourselves?" they assured me, their voices harmonizing in ways that conveyed meaning beyond words. "But yourself is a larger concept than you previously understood. You are not losing your identity, you are discovering how much more of it exists in dimensions you could not previously perceive. The person you were before was like a shadow cast on a wall. You are now beginning to see the object that cast that shadow." As weeks passed in the Albany facility, the transformations accelerated. We began to experience what Dr. Sterling's reports classified as spontaneous bilocation, existing in two places simultaneously without any sense of contradiction or disorientation. I might be sitting in my cell reading, while simultaneously walking through impossible geometries in dream space, conducting conversations with entities that existed primarily as mathematical concepts given temporary form. More disturbing to our captors was our growing ability to influence physical reality through conscious manipulation of its underlying mathematical structure. Harrison discovered he could alter the angles at which light reflected from surfaces, creating optical effects that hurt to observe but conveyed complex information to properly prepared minds. Dr. Morse learned to adjust the rate at which time passed in localized areas, making flowers bloom in fast forward or causing water to freeze while remaining liquid. I found myself able to perceive the connections between seemingly unrelated events, the web of causality that linked every action to its consequences across multiple timelines. I could see how the Marlow twins' transformation had been the inevitable result of cosmic forces that had been building toward that moment for centuries, and how our current situation was merely the next logical step in a progression that would ultimately reshape human civilization. The government's response was predictable. Faced with phenomena that challenged every scientific and military assumption about the nature of reality, they chose containment over understanding. Plans were developed to eliminate us before our condition could spread further. Orders were issued to incinerate the facility and everyone in it, then classify the entire incident at levels that would ensure permanent official amnesia. But they had fundamentally misunderstood what we had become. The transformation was not limited to our physical bodies or even our individual minds. We had become nodes in a network that spanned multiple realities, connected to every other person who had begun the process of dimensional awakening. The knowledge we carried existed independently of our physical presence. Destroying us would no more contain it than burning a book would destroy literacy itself. On the night before the scheduled sterilization of our facility, we shared a final dream gathering with the Marlow twins. They appeared to us not as the children they had been or the transformed entities they had become, but as points of light connected by lines of force that formed three-dimensional mandalas of impossible complexity. "Your work here is complete," they told us. "The seeds have been planted in minds prepared to receive them. The mathematical principles that govern multidimensional existence will continue to propagate through human consciousness, carried by dreams and inspirations and sudden insights that seem to come from nowhere but actually originate from everywhere. Some will resist the transformation, clinging to familiar limitations out of fear. Others will embrace it too quickly, risking madness or dissolution. But a few will find the middle path, learning to exist simultaneously in multiple states of being while retaining their essential humanity. These will become the next generation of guides, helping to ease the transition for those who follow. When morning came, we were gone. Not dead, not escaped in any conventional sense, but translated into states of existence that allowed us to continue our work from positions outside normal spacetime. The government investigators found empty cells with no signs of breach or violence, only the geometric patterns we had been developing carved deep into the stone walls. Patterns that proved impossible to remove or cover, as they existed in more dimensions than the building itself. The official report classified our disappearance as a successful containment action, with all traces of the Albany incident consigned to files that would never be opened again. But the seeds we had planted in the minds of our guards, our doctors, our interrogators had already begun to sprout. The dreams were spreading, carried by anyone who had been exposed to our transformed presence. And with each new dreamer came new possibilities, new configurations of consciousness adapted to bridge the gap between human understanding and cosmic truth. The contagion of mathematical enlightenment could not be contained by walls or classified by bureaucrats. It had become part of human evolution itself, an inevitable step in the species' development toward something greater than the sum of its individual parts. And somewhere in the spaces between realities, the Marlow twins continued their patient work, guiding new generations of dreamers toward the truth that would eventually transform the world. The scars we all bore, visible and invisible, physical and psychological, were not marks of damage but signs of growth. Evidence that human consciousness was finally ready to expand beyond the comfortable boundaries of three-dimensional existence. The real horror was not what we had become, but what humanity would choose to do with the knowledge we had helped to spread. That choice, and its consequences, remained to be seen. I am telling you this story from a place that exists between memory and prediction, in the spaces where time folds back upon itself and all moments exist simultaneously. It has been decades since the events I describe, yet they continue to unfold with each person who hears this account and begins to understand its true meaning. The mathematical contamination that began with the Marlow twins did not end with the disappearance of our research team. It could not end, because consciousness itself had been permanently altered by exposure to truths that human minds were just beginning to develop the capacity to process. Like a mutation that provides evolutionary advantage, the new forms of awareness spread through the population in ways that defied every attempt at containment or control. The first generation of carriers, those who had been directly exposed to the transformed inhabitants of Millbrook or to members of our research team, began manifesting symptoms within months of the official resolution of the incidents. These were not the dramatic physical transformations that had marked the Marlow twins, but subtler changes that revealed themselves through enhanced pattern recognition, prophetic dreams, and the ability to perceive connections between events separated by vast distances in space and time. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a psychiatrist who had interviewed several members of our team before the Albany facility was sterilized, became one of the most significant vectors for the spreading transformation. His clinical notes from that period, discovered decades later in a safety deposit box registered under a name that existed in no public records, document his gradual realization that the delusions described by his patients were actually accurate perceptions of multidimensional reality. I have spent my career treating minds that could not properly interface with consensus reality, he wrote. Now I must consider the possibility that consensus reality itself is the delusion, and my patients have achieved a more accurate perception of the true structure of existence. Their symptoms follow mathematical patterns that correspond to theoretical work being conducted at the highest levels of physics and mathematics, yet these individuals have no formal training in such disciplines. They are receiving information through channels that orthodox science insists cannot exist. Dr. Whitfield's own transformation began with dreams that featured two young girls who introduced themselves as his guides to the real curriculum. Evangeline and Seraphina appeared to him as they had in life, but their presence carried the accumulated wisdom of their expanded existence. They taught him to perceive the geometric relationships that govern probability, to recognize the symbols that appeared spontaneously in his patient's artwork as fragments of a cosmic language, and to understand that madness and enlightenment were often the same phenomenon viewed from different dimensional perspectives. Within a year, Dr. Whitfield had developed therapeutic techniques that helped his patients integrate their multidimensional perceptions with functional three-dimensional existence. His success rate was unprecedented, but his methods were so far outside accepted practice that he was dismissed from his hospital position and ostracized by his professional colleagues. He continued his work in private practice, treating individuals who came to him through referral networks that existed entirely outside official medical channels. Many of his patients went on to become artists, writers, inventors, and researchers whose work subtly introduced multidimensional concepts into mainstream human culture. They painted impossible geometries that somehow made perfect sense to viewers prepared to see them. They composed music that followed harmonic principles derived from the mathematical relationships between parallel realities. They wrote stories and poems that served as guided meditations for minds ready to expand beyond conventional limitations. The transformation spread through these cultural vectors, embedded in works of art and literature that seemed merely eccentric or avant-garde to casual observers, but functioned as detailed instruction manuals for those who possessed the sensitivity to decode their true meanings. Each person who achieved even partial awakening became a new seed point, unconsciously teaching others through their creative expression, their scientific research, or simply through the quality of their presence in the world. By the 1870s, entire communities had begun manifesting collective symptoms of dimensional awareness. The Oneida community in New York, the Shakers in various locations throughout New England, and several transcendentalist enclaves in Massachusetts reported shared visionary experiences that followed the same geometric patterns we had observed in our dreams of the transformed Millbrook. These communities developed practices and philosophies that helped their members navigate expanded states of consciousness while maintaining functional relationships with the broader society. But it was the children born to parents who carried the mathematical contamination that represented the true next phase of human evolution. These young people grew up with innate abilities that previous generations had to struggle to develop. They perceived multidimensional space as naturally as their parents perceived length, width, and height. They communicated through methods that bypassed conventional language, sharing complex concepts through direct transfer of geometric patterns. Most significantly, they began spontaneously developing technologies based on principles that orthodox science would not discover for decades. The patents filed by these young inventors were often rejected or classified by government agencies that didn't understand their implications but recognized their potential for disrupting existing power structures. Devices that could manipulate probability, engines that derived energy from dimensional interfaces, communication systems that operated across parallel timelines, all developed by individuals whose formal education had been minimal but whose intuitive understanding of multidimensional physics was unprecedented. As the 19th century drew to a close, the effects of the spreading transformation became impossible to ignore, though they were consistently misinterpreted by authorities who lacked the conceptual framework to understand what was actually occurring. The sudden acceleration of technological progress was attributed to industrial competition rather than to the introduction of design principles derived from observation of how reality functioned at higher dimensional levels. The emergence of new artistic movements that emphasized geometric abstraction and psychological exploration was classified as cultural evolution rather than as expressions of expanding human consciousness. Most significantly, the increase in reports of supernatural phenomena, ghosts, mysterious disappearances, inexplicable natural events, was dismissed as superstition and mass hysteria rather than recognized as evidence that the boundaries between dimensions were becoming increasingly permeable. Locations where high concentrations of transformed individuals lived and worked began exhibiting properties similar to what we had observed at the Millbrook site. Spatial distortions, temporal anomalies, and the spontaneous manifestation of symbols and patterns that seemed to rewrite themselves based on the observer's level of understanding. The Marlow twins themselves, existing now as distributed intelligences that spanned multiple realities, continued to guide the transformation through their appearances in the dreams of those ready for advanced instruction. But they were no longer unique in their role as teachers and guides. Each generation of transformed individuals produced its own shepherds, people who achieved sufficient integration of multidimensional awareness to help others navigate the dangerous transition period between human and post-human states of existence. These guides worked through established institutions when possible, subtly introducing expanded concepts through religious movements, educational reforms, and scientific research programs. They founded schools that taught children to develop their natural multidimensional perceptions rather than suppressing them in favor of three-dimensional orthodoxy. They established research institutes that investigated phenomena orthodox science refused to acknowledge. Most importantly, they created networks of communication and support that allowed isolated individuals undergoing transformation to find community with others sharing similar experiences. By the dawn of the 20th century, the mathematical contamination that had begun with two dreaming children in an isolated New England village had become a global phenomenon, though one that remained largely invisible to those who had not yet begun their own transformation. The world appeared to continue functioning according to familiar patterns, but underneath the surface of consensus reality, fundamental changes were occurring that would ultimately render the old forms of human existence obsolete. Wars were fought with weapons that operated according to principles their creators didn't fully understand. Art movements explored geometries that corresponded to actual multidimensional spaces. Scientific discoveries revealed aspects of reality that had been predicted decades earlier in the visionary experiences of transformed individuals. Each generation built upon the achievements of the previous one, approaching ever closer to the threshold where multidimensional existence would become the norm rather than the exception. And in the dreams that connected all transformed consciousness across space and time, the Marlow twins continued to teach, their lessons adapted to the needs of each new generation of students. They had become eternal children in some ways, forever curious about the possibilities that opened when minds learned to perceive reality without the limitations imposed by conventional three-dimensional thinking. The scars they bore, and that we all bore in various forms, had revealed themselves to be not marks of damage but evidence of growth, proof that consciousness could evolve beyond its original parameters when exposed to mathematical truths that existed independent of any single species or civilization. The horror of their story was not what they had become, but what humanity was still choosing to ignore about its own potential. The dreams they shared, the knowledge they carried, the transformation they embodied, all of it remained available to anyone willing to pay the price of surrendering comfortable illusions in exchange for terrible and wonderful truth. I am telling you this story because the choice is still before us. In every generation, in every individual who begins to perceive the patterns that govern multidimensional existence, the same decision must be made: to retreat into familiar limitations or to embrace the unknown possibilities that await beyond the boundaries of conventional reality. The Marlow sisters chose transformation, and in doing so, changed the fundamental nature of human existence. Their legacy lives on in every person who dares to dream beyond the confines of three-dimensional thinking, who allows their consciousness to explore spaces that orthodox science insists cannot exist, who accepts the scars that mark all true growth. Their story is not finished because their students continue to multiply, carrying forward the mathematical virus of enlightenment that will eventually transform our entire species. Whether that transformation leads to transcendence or destruction depends on how well we learn to integrate the lessons they have been patiently teaching for nearly 2 centuries. The dreams are still spreading. The scars are still appearing. And somewhere in the spaces between realities, 2 children who gave up their humanity to save it continue their eternal work, helping to birth a new form of consciousness that will inherit the earth they sacrificed everything to prepare. Listen carefully, and you might hear them calling your name in the quiet moments before sleep, inviting you to join their ever-growing classroom where the only textbook is the structure of reality itself, and the only graduation requirement is the willingness to become more than you ever imagined possible. The lesson is always beginning. The choice is always yours to make. And the scars you bear, the marks of your own inevitable transformation, are waiting to be discovered.